Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Božidar from Business Review Webinars, and today I'll be your host. It is my great pleasure to welcome Integrated Technologies Limited, who will be presenting a webinar titled Start Small, Think Big. Today's guest speaker is Tom Ackrill, Business Development Manager. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar platform, On24. You'll notice that this webinar is browser-based. So if you disconnect for any reason, please just click on the link that you received via email and you'll be able to reconnect. In order to ask questions, you can send them in via the questions widget. Just type them into the box at the top left-hand corner of your screen and then click submit. We'll allocate some time at the end of the session to address any questions or thoughts that you may have. Please use the yellow help widget at the bottom if you require any assistance, and you can move, resize, and maximize any of the windows in front of you to get a better view of the slides. But now, allow me to welcome Tom.
Thank you very much indeed. And yes, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever everyone happens to be joining us from today. So as mentioned, my name's Tom. I'm ITL's Business Development Manager. And for today's webinar, I wanted to do a little bit on effectively some early thinking that will pay dividends later on in your product design lifecycle. Now, this is predominantly aimed at medical, diagnostic, IVD, laboratory, that sort of industry, but it is equally applicable to other industries as well. But just bear that in mind while we're thinking that obviously I'm talking about ITL's bread and butter. Now, on the subject of ITL's bread and butter, I thought the best place to start is for those of you who don't know who we are, is just to give you a quick introduction. So we as a company have been around for a little while now. We were established back in 1977. And since August 2018, we became part of the G&H Hausco PLC group of companies. Ooh, bear with me, sorry, my mouse is misbehaving. There we are. There's approximately 140 staff within ITL and many hundreds more within the larger group. And although we're headquartered in the UK, we as ITL also have facilities in Virginia, in the United States, and in Shanghai, in China. As you'd expect for a medical device company, we hold the usual accreditations you'd expect, 9001, 13485, and of course FDA GMP accreditation. Relatively unique, certainly within the UK and within Western Europe, that we're what we term a full service company. So we can go right from the initial design phases, feasibility, whether or not something is even going to get off the ground, all the way through prototyping, design, development, manufacturing, and after-sales support. And we allow our customers to effectively dip in and out of that service offering as they need and help themselves to the tools they need to complete their project. Now, for today's webinar, the things that I really want to consider here are our design approach, actually scaling up, and a little bit around cost versus price, and why those two things are sometimes conflated together when actually they're quite different in and of themselves. Now, this is a subject could go on for a heck of a lot longer than the 1 hour that's allocated for this, so I appreciate some things I will gloss over or move relatively quickly through. Just bear in mind that obviously afterwards we'll take as many questions as we can. The other thing I'd like you to bear in mind as well is something along these lines. Now, what you see on the screen at the moment is ITL's product development lifecycle. Every company working in the medical industry will have something along these lines. The words may be slightly different, the terminology might be slightly different, but the core effort is very much the same. And the idea is based around a controlled, stage-gated process where at each stage you're minimizing risk, you're maximizing R&D and production return, and you're ensuring that you have a controlled and well-understood development program. And some of the subjects we're going to be talking about today will be involved right in the early stages, others later on in the program. And you as yourselves may have your own company process that you follow, and hopefully you'll find a lot of this is effectively mappable to that process as well. If you want to study this one in more detail, it is available on the ITL website as a resource. So starting off with our design approach, and this is something that I think really is considering what's the point? What are we trying to develop and why are we developing it? And broadly speaking, that's divided into what I call the what, the why, and the how. Now, the what is very much the product that we're looking at. This is where we're looking at what market segments we're going into, what strategies we're going to use, how big or how small the device is going to be, where it's going to be used, who's going to use it. And these are all fundamental questions that need to be asked really in the early stages of development programs, so that you know exactly who your target market, your target audience, your target user is going to be. And why are you developing it? Every product needs to be bringing a solution if it's going to be successful in the market. So what's driving this product? Is it market feedback? Is it an unmet need? Is there problems with existing technologies? Is it an evolution of an existing technology that you or your competitors have in the marketplace? Is it a replacement for an older technology? Or have you gone, the most intensive version, which is a disruptive or innovative technology? And the last, of course, is the how, which is mainly based around your business model, sales model, manufacturing, logistics, time, cost. We won't touch so much on the how. We will go in a little bit, but predominantly here we're looking at the what. So without further ado, my first bit of advice here really is never assume. A lot of the times when we see clients that are just starting their development life cycle, they've made a lot of assumptions over what the market is looking for, what the market wants, what the market needs, what the client is looking for. And this can be dangerous. You can often find yourself developing a product that isn't what your market wants. And by the time you realize that error, you're too far down the process. So first of all, we never assume. We always go by what is the market looking for. Market wants and market needs, although the terminology is often used together, are quite different. What the market wants, what is the problem that it's solving, and how is it solving it? The market needs, there can often be some bells and whistles, some extra features, some extra topics, techniques, or functionality that, although nice to have, are not necessarily what's going to be bringing home the bacon in the future for you as a business. Now, what are we looking at here when we talk of market needs and market wants? Now, market needs, generally speaking, are going to be affecting your core patient experience. It's going to be delivering your treatment. It's going to be delivering your diagnostic. It's going to be the thing that the patient notices, or at least the patient is most affected by. This is the core of the experience. A lot of the time, there are extra add-ons that can make life easier. For example, a product that is maybe smaller, or a product that has some extra usability or some extra user features. But those are wants. The product will perform the treatment perfectly well, or deliver the therapy perfectly well, just on its needs. Market needs will also fundamentally affect the commercial success of your product. If your product doesn't address what the needs of the market are, it's not necessarily going to gain any sort of traction, whereas market wants, these are your bolt-ons. I liken this to you purchasing a car. The needs, they're the simple things: engines, doors, mirrors. The wants, these are your heated seats, your DAB radio, and all those extra add-ons that make things just a little bit nicer. Crucially, though, your market needs are what drive your design cost and time and effort, and also what's going to drive your unit and or treatment cost, because those needs are unavoidable. They are required for your product to be successful, and as a minimum, that's going to affect what you see as your development cost. Your wants effectively act as conflations. They'll add on and they'll make it bigger, longer program. So if you understand your needs as opposed to your wants, you're very much looking at your route to market in the quickest possible form. The biggest impact that I think we see here is feature set. Certainly in terms of what has the biggest impact on the time to market, your unit price, and your business strategy. It's very much important, certainly in the early days, if it's a new product or a new market or a new technique, is focus on the initial goal, the version 1, or what someone that gets called the minimum viable product. Something that's going to come onto the market in good time and in good order, and ideally gives you a pipeline of other products or evolutions of product or add-ons, accessories, things of that nature. It's a really useful way of giving yourself a product pipeline by getting an initial base model and then being able to develop on from there. And one of the big areas we notice is that technology and regulatory, certainly in the medical market, are not necessarily connected to each other in the way that you might hope. In these areas, I'm talking around things like EMC performance, cybersecurity, and indeed transport and ambulatory. A lot of the times there are features and wish sets that we see with our user heads on, with our commercial users and commercial products on, where we want wireless communications, we want wireless interfaces, we want Bluetooth, wireless charging, we want all these feature sets, which again, as add-ons are fantastic, but the impact of those on things like EMC, as soon as you bring wireless or Bluetooth or anything of that nature into the equation, you are going to increase your costs. So focus on, again, those features that are there because you have to have them, as opposed to because they are bolt-ons. The next big area that's worth thinking about is the footprint of the product. And generally speaking here, we divide this roughly into handheld devices and benchtop devices. Handheld devices are generally seen as almost the holy grail. Everyone wants a test that they can reduce into something the size of your mobile phone, like mine here. That's effectively the holy grail of all products, something that we probably see when we see ourselves watching sci-fi programs, those of us that are into Star Trek or the like. Everything is tiny and handheld and solves the problem instantly. And that's a fantastic approach. And as I put on here on the slide here, fourth point down, you get that marketing value, you get that snazziness, which is half the battle of selling a product, is make people want it. There are other complications, of course, that go with a handheld product, generally around the level of integration that's required. To shrink something down from something that maybe 10 or 20 years ago was a box in a lab, to break that down to a handheld device, you're looking at a very integrated design. And that has a lot of effect on design cost and design time and product time. Certainly on your NREs, on your non-recurring expenditure, or your engineering expenditure. Highly integrated designs, by design, have more engineering effort gone into them to maximize the space use, to minimize the space envelope. You also have added complications that the power management increases because you're now reliant on batteries. You can't be carrying around a power pack or a mains cable traipsing across a hospital or a field hospital or a clinic, which means you've got to have a lot more power management. And batteries, of course, as we all know from the issues that Samsung had with lithium batteries, can in themselves cause a headache. So there is a lot to be said for sticking with a benchtop instrument. You don't have to be quite so integrated. Yes, space is always a concern within any sort of hospital or laboratory or medical space, but you've got a little bit more space than the palm of your hand. You can run it from mains power. You don't have to necessarily worry so much about power storage. Now, you may choose to have battery backup or things of that nature, but you're not reliant on high energy density, small footprint batteries in order to make your product work. And you're not limited by the life of that battery. Of course, with a handheld device, you have the ultimate in flexibility. You see the image of products being used in field hospitals around the world, in lower income countries, in countries where healthcare is more disparate, more spread. You can take the treatment to the patient, where perhaps the patient can't come to the treatment or the diagnostic. It really does depend on, coming back again to what we said earlier, is what is your market need? What is the actual core requirement of this product? If it's a product that, and we'll get on to use case in a minute, but if it's a product that is always going to be used in an air-conditioned hospital, laboratory environment, you don't need to go to the same level of ruggedizing as a product that is going out into sub-Saharan Africa, for example, or parts of Asia in the wet season. You don't need that same level of ruggedization. Which brings us nicely on to our use case. And this is where it's worth spending the time really looking at what environment is your product going to be used in, and taking on board those design impacts and things that will come to bite you later if you do or don't choose to implement them now. And here I think is probably the three most classic examples of what we see, what I'll call field use, what I'll call hospital use, and home use. I think that probably covers the bulk of medical devices that we see and diagnostic devices that we see. And they all have their own challenges. As I mentioned before, a field-based instrument is at the mercy of its environment. You have a much greater temperature range, humidity range, altitude even. You get interesting situations if you look at products that have got to work in somewhere like Mexico City with extreme altitudes versus something that's perhaps on a little bit more of a standard altitude. You get into IP rating, dust and water ingress, and again, power capacity and management, because a field device may or may not have access to battery backup, may or may not have access to mains power, may or may not be powered from a vehicle, for example. But you have to allow for sufficient power reserves, as well as all the proofing and all the protection needed to give you a field serviceable instrument. Clinics, hospitals, doctors' surgeries, although of course you don't necessarily have to contend with changing humidity, changing weather, changing temperatures to the same extent. You do have other needs that come into the equation. Now, decontamination, for example, is a big one here. Most hospitals, as we'll all know, will have some level of pathogen control or bacterial control or hygiene control that has to be adhered to. And the last thing they want, for example, is an instrument with lots of nooks and crannies in its casework, lots of hidden reservoirs and hidden corners where biological material can build up and cause issues. You may also find in these environments that there is a natural desire to integrate with a hospital management system, a patient management system, or a data management system. Because again, going back to what the market wants are, there is often a drive to say plug and play with every limb system in the world. And this isn't always achievable, isn't always desirable, or indeed isn't always necessary, but it is something to be aware of. You may find in those settings, clinicians and healthcare givers do want to be able to pull information from the device. And finally, throughput. How often is this device going to be used in a clinic or a hospital? You may see it's a specialized piece of kit that's only being used infrequently, but is offering critical care, life support, life-maintaining treatment. Or you may find that it's something that is used to a lesser extent. It's a diagnostic tool, but it's high volume. And things here, for example, the classic one that we see is cartridge design. A lot of the time now there is a desire for a microfluidic or a fluidic cartridge or chip to work with an instrument. And often there is a need for electrical conductivity between the cartridge and the instrument, some sort of interface to transfer data, provide power, provide information. And those connectors have a lifespan. So again, understanding your lifespan will help you in your component selection, which will help you in your scaling requirements. The last thing you would want, for example, using some hypothetical numbers, is a device that is going to be used 500 times a day, but you have a cartridge that will wear out, you have an interface that will wear out after a few thousand uses. No client in the world is going to want a device where it requires back-to-base servicing or field servicing every few weeks. Now, that's an extreme option, I appreciate, but it is an example of something that does and can happen in a development program. The last area here that we look at is home use. And home use is, again, something that is gaining traction and gaining interest because it minimizes it improves the patient experience. The patient isn't having to travel to the hospital if they're infirm or unable to travel in some other way. It makes life a lot easier. It reduces the burden on hospital staff because they're able to attend to other patients that perhaps do need more hands-on care. And it also just frees up generally the whole system. It's less demanding on the healthcare system as a whole. But what you do have to assume here is you have got some changes. First of all, the user. You're no longer talking here about using a qualified nurse or doctor or surgeon or clinician. You're not having that same level of expertise. You have to assume that it could be someone that's elderly, it could be a child, it could be someone who perhaps has mobility issues or sight issues or some other issue that this product is helping with. And the product will have to account for that. Aside of that, it's the ease of use, the ease of maintenance, and the ease of understanding. Nobody wants a product really at home, and we all do this. If we buy even a simple domestic device like a kettle or a microwave, we don't want to have to read and understand a user manual this thick before we can make a cup of tea. I'm being very British there and using the kettle and the cup of tea. But it needs to be that ease of use and ease of understanding that makes the patient want to perform the treatment or feel confident to perform the treatment, as opposed to the alternative, where you see treatments not being carried out at home because the user feels unable or unwilling to use the product, And then, of course, their health suffers as an effect, or their recovery suffers, or their treatment suffers. And last of all is the form factor. Products that are going to be in the home, certainly if they're larger products or they're likely to be on display, you don't necessarily want to look like, a sheet metal box with some screws holding it together. There may be a desire to have something that is perhaps a little more discreet or a little more user-friendly or a little bit more suitable in a home environment. And that may potentially drive your industrial design strategy a little bit differently in order to make sure that you're meeting those requirements. So it's very worth taking the time to understand your use case and really narrow down on what your use case is going to be. The ideal product, the ideal theoretical product may be that it can work anywhere and everywhere from the Sahara Desert to the Amazon rainforest to outer space. In reality, where is the product going to be used 80% of its time? If it's going to be used mostly in a clinic, target that first. You can do a home use version later. Equally, if it's got to be a field instrument, accept that as part of your design, you have to allow for things like humidity proofing, IP rating, power management, and they are going to bolt onto your design efforts. So the question everyone now is probably asking is, Tom, why did we sit through the first 10 slides? And this is really to start to pull together a feeling of some of the early decisions that can be made. The project of today is not the product of tomorrow. And it's something that has to be considered all the way through, is our project can evolve, and the product that you reach at the end, that's what you're aiming for. That's your target. And all the things we've discussed so far, our use cases, our features, and our market, will come together to give us our final product that's clinically effective, it's delivering the treatment that we want in a way that we want. It's market driven. There is feedback from the market saying this product works for us. This product meets the needs of the patients, of the clinicians, of the families, of the healthcare workers. And more important for us as business people, it's profitable. There is business case here for a profitable organization that will allow us to continue to support those patients in the future once this product goes onto the market. Now, pulling this all together, our features, our footprint, and our use case, these are what form our minimum viable product. And I'll use this expression throughout the rest of the presentation, minimum viable product, that product which is meeting the clinical needs, the business needs, and the patient needs all at the same time. Our minimum viable product is really important because what that's driving is a few things. Our development cost, our R&D costs, because we'll have chosen the features, the footprint, the level of complexity, the level of design and integration will be heavily driven by that development cost. The unit cost, the most important bit, while this does also link back to our development cost, generally speaking, the more features, the more tightly integrated, or the more complex the system, the higher the unit cost we're going to be looking at. Your NREs, your non-recurring expenses, or your engineering expenses, to use the idea again of a very, very tightly integrated product, in order to give you that tight integration and or that low unit cost, you're often looking at a very heavily tooled design. You're looking at much more in-depth tooling, much more in-depth integration. That will drive your NREs further up than perhaps a less integrated or a larger product or a higher price point product. And of course, your timeline. The more you're having to develop, the more innovative that you're having to be, the more complex you're having to work for a product to become, the longer that timeline is going to be, the longer your route to market, the longer your timeline to market, sorry. The other great bit of information that comes from combining this use case, these features, and our market data is that we can start to understand our market size. We can start to see what market are we going into with our initial product. And that may not be the whole market. You may find that the initial minimum viable product is just targeting one market segment. To use the example, you may choose that in the first instance, you're going to go into, for example, sports science before you move to medical, or veterinary before you move to medical. You compare two different markets. Or it may be that you go for a clinical product first, a clinical setting, and a home use product later. But you will understand what that market size is. Crucially, you'll understand your production volumes. How many products are you going to make per month, per quarter, per year, over the next 5 years, over the next 8 years, 10 years. And that at the moment is a challenge entirely in itself, certainly around the electronics component shortages that we're seeing. But that will also help to drive a lot of your manufacturing methods, because different volumes will have different effects. A much higher volume, again, you might be looking at higher throughput production, you might be looking at increased automation, increased testing. And we'll talk about some of these areas shortly. And indeed, your target price. Where do you need to be on the market, either per test or per product or per treatment? Where do you line up, not only in the market for yourselves, but against your competitors? And are you going to have a competitive edge either in treatment cost or investment cost or cost of getting into the marketplace? All these things will come together and tell you exactly where you need to head with your development. Now, we talked about scaling up, and from small acorns grow great trees. We're focusing a little bit here on production volumes. It's an area that has a great impact. I did say this is a big topic. We'll be glancing over a few things, but hopefully it'll give you something to think about. Generally speaking, with production volumes, the impact that comes from then is our component procurement, our methods, our quantities, our testing on our electronics and our assemblies, our mechanical assembly and test, and indeed our final release and shipping. And these are all areas where design ethos and design approach can really pay dividends later on towards the end of the program. So we'll go into these in a little bit more detail now. So first of all, component procurement. Now, this is an area which currently is being a bit of a nightmare, as I'm sure everyone here that is working any sort of electronics market is finding. Components are becoming increasingly hard to find, increasingly scarce, and indeed they're becoming incredibly expensive. And this is a problem that I personally think we'll see for at least the next 12 months. So this needs to be taken with a little pinch of salt and perhaps applied to your specific product needs. Generally speaking, when we're looking at component procurement and certainly component selection at the design level, we're looking at these four things. Is it available? Is it suitable? Is it manageable? And is it replaceable? Taking each of those in turn. Is it available? Can we physically source this component at the moment? Now, ignoring, as I mentioned earlier, the current state of the electronics market, where is the component in its life cycle? Is it a component that is heading towards end of life? Is it a component that is becoming obsolete? Is it a component that is new onto the market and therefore perhaps untested is the wrong word, but has less of a provenance than another part that is maybe in the middle of its design life cycle? And there are many, many, many tools available for doing that. As ITL, we use a tool called Silicon Expert. There are other products on the market and other companies out there that offer similar services to help you check that your components are indeed available. And how broadly available is that component? If you're thinking of scaling up later, perhaps multi-source manufacturing, are you picking components that are available on a global market? Or are you perhaps picking materials that are only available in certain parts of the world? Suitable. Does the component that you've chosen function well within its specification? Or have you chosen a component where you're required to either, and we're talking electronics here, either run it right at the top end of its specification or worse, out of specification? And you've actively chosen product where that part will have to go above and beyond what the manufacturer has designed it to do to meet your requirement. And is that a sensible approach? For some people, the choice will be yes. They may have no choice, and that may be the only option available to them. Or it may be, with hindsight, they wouldn't have chosen that part. But deciding now, are you choosing a component that is going to work within specification? Now, you may ask why that's sitting within the manufacturing environment. Think with the production head-on. Parts that are operating outside of their tolerance are likely to fail more regularly or live a shorter lifespan than perhaps a component being driven within its specification. The knock-on for that, of course, is you're looking at perhaps a lower manufacturing yield if that tolerance is exceeded during the assembly and test process. It may be that you have a unit that requires greater servicing, either field servicing or back-to-base servicing. Or you may find that it's a product that you now end up with a much higher reject rate at your goods in, at your inspection process. These will all add cost onto your product in the long run if you have a lower yield or a higher reject rate. And of course, if you're running a product outside of a specification, Your warranties and your support from the manufacturer of those components, and indeed the assembler of the product, may be compromised to some extent. Is the component manageable? Have you picked a component that is particularly fragile or particularly susceptible to outside interference, either temperature, ESD, or light reactive, or some other way difficult to handle or manage? Is your manufacturing service or manufacturing partner, or if you're doing it in-house, your manufacturing team, going to have to invest in specialist equipment, specialist storage, specialist handling because of a component selection? Is there an alternative? Do you have no choice but to impact on production in that way? Or is there perhaps a different way that you could choose, or a different product that you could choose to get the same solution? And how replaceable is it? Now, we all like to think that nothing's replaceable, but the reality is, certainly with a medical device, certain components are deemed critical, certainly if they're on the mains power inlet, for example, the mains power circuit, or they're in some other way critical to the performance of the device. But how unique is it? Is it the only one in the world? Did you pick one from a set of 5, from a set of 10, from a set of 20? And how vulnerable is the design that you're developing without that component? If that part suddenly became unavailable or obsolete or couldn't be obtained, or a price shift happened, how stuck are you? How much effort would you have to go through? Would you have to respin a PCB? Would you have to revalidate your instrument? Would you have to go back through any of your regulatory testing? And what can you choose now that perhaps will help you at that later point in life? And one of the great suggestions we often give now is, if you are designing a product, do you already have alternatives specified for your critical parts? So that if the worst happens and your first choice part is unavailable, do you have a second component that you can pick up and use, or that you can easily source and use without having to repeat all of the regulatory testing later? Now, once we've purchased the components, we have to assemble and test them. And here, if you look at the display, we are effectively looking at everything coming together to give us commercially feasible electronics. And broadly speaking here, the 3 areas that we're picking up: layout, test, and assembly. There are often opportunities where product methodology that is used in R&D, perhaps in the prototype phase or perhaps in low volume, is not necessarily scalable. Something that you can handle when you're making perhaps 1s, 2s, 5s, 10s for prototyping purposes. You have experienced electronics engineers that are perhaps adept at hand soldering or can make modifications on the fly, to use the expression. Whereas a production environment, if you're going through a surface mount line setup, that kind of variability is not optimal. It's not going to help in the longer term. So is your layout optimized? Pad sizes for components on PCBs. Have you got components that only just fit within the dimensions of the pad, only just fit within the space envelope? Have you got components that are very close together? Have you got a higher risk of shorts between components? What's the panel size of that PCB? Is it something that you are forced to make in very large panels and therefore have a higher risk of scrap, for example, if you have 2 parts too close together, or an assembly issue? Or have you got a lower panel size that, although requires bigger throughput because you're only populating a smaller number of boards, gives you the control and the flexibility on your volumes? And how have you laid your board? Are you looking at single-sided boards or double-sided boards? Are you looking at very complex, very heavily in looking at assembly? Have you got a very component-dense product that's using lots of very small package sizes? Or have you perhaps allowed for some space and allowed for some room within the product? And finally, looking at your test, how are you going to test this PCB? And the urge, again, in the R&D environment generally tends to be that you want to have absolute certainty that PCB is functioning correctly. So in an ideal world, you will test every function on every board, every component, every pathway, and every possible use case to know completely that PCB is going to function exactly the way you want it to. By the time you reach a production level and you're scaling up, the more testing you're adding, the more cost, the more time that you're adding. Now, while there are ways, for example, of reducing that testing, an example here we've got at ITL is we have a flying probe system now, which allows us to very rapidly test PCBs and perform a lot of tests very quickly. But that relies on the board being capable of being tested via flying probe. And also that, quite frankly, your design center or your design partner, your manufacturing partner, has that level of functionality. If you have a board that's very complex, very small, and very difficult to test and relies entirely on operators testing by hand, that's going to drive up your manufacturing cost. And it's also going to make life more difficult when you're fault finding, if you do have an issue. So taking the time now to decide on your testing regime and actually what testing do you need to do and what testing would you like to do? Are you looking at perhaps you want to just check a voltage across a few components and you can infer therefore that the system is functional? Or perhaps you're going to have a module test that will tell you whether or not the board is functional because the module passes. You can decide at what point you decide enough testing is enough. By the time you're reaching the production stage, you should be in a situation where you can reduce your level of testing on the production line because you validated that design within R&D. Similarly, in a mechanical environment, what we're looking for here is a commercially feasible manufacturing design. And again, I've broken this down into 3 areas. Suitability being the first one. And here I'm concerning myself mainly with mechanical engineering in terms of tolerances on drawings. So here we're talking tolerances on things like machining, on the size of any holes that are being cut through or channels that are being cut through, size tolerances, thickness tolerances, things of that nature. Have you got suitable tolerances on your drawings that can be achieved by your contractor? I think too often we see products that perhaps cannot be manufactured to the tolerance specified by the design authority because they haven't consulted with the manufacturer early enough. Is your tooling approach, and here we're looking at casework or, for example, molded optics or something of that nature, is your tooling suitable for the volumes you're looking at? Have you perhaps invested in tooling early enough to give you the ability to scale up? Have you gone to hard tooling, multi-impression bolsters, things of that nature? Or are you still running off of P20 tooling or silicon tooling or rapid tooling? These decisions and when you choose to place that NRE cost can have a big impact on your mechanical cost of goods. Equally, assembly. Do you need special fixings or special adhesives that are perhaps going to come with, I'm using the UK here, but KOSH would be the equivalent of somewhere like OSHA in the United States. Have you got any particular use cases? Have you got a product that is perhaps carcinogenic or particularly difficult adhesive to use? Do you need jigs and fixtures? Again, in an R&D environment, when you're building low volumes, individual engineers tend to be highly skilled, highly dexterous, and can do this work. In a production environment, you perhaps have different skill sets or a higher volume where you don't want to have to spend a long time assembling something. Jigs and fixtures to give you that repeatability and that reliability have a huge impact here. And again, like all things, testing. How do we test those sub-assemblies, those modules, and indeed that unit at the top, that final top-level product where everything comes together? Speaking much like in R&D with the electronic side, you can make the level of testing here as high or as low as you wish, but you do have to accept that the more testing, the more extreme, the greater the cost that's associated with that. And indeed, our final release and shipping. Now here we're going to have a lot of documentation coming together to form our device history record, and how much documentation, how complex our logistics are going to be, and how much acceptance testing is performed. This all has a huge cost on your product. Again, the more testing, the more documentation, there is a minimum that you will have to achieve in order to satisfy a regulatory body or an auditor. But are you going above and beyond? Are you doing too much testing? Take the time now to talk to your manufacturer, talk to your partners and say, what's the minimum that you need in order to allow us to get a product together, out the door, in a cost-efficient and timely fashion? And finally, cost versus price. Money, money, money. The bit that everyone is concerned about. And this is really just to act as a thinking tool. I'm not going to dwell on this too long because I want to make sure that we have time for a Q&A. But everything has a cost and a price. Now, cost is exactly what you think. It's the dollars, it's the pounds, it's the euros, it's the yen, it's the renminbi that's behind your product. The price is what's that going to do to your product. And I pulled out a few options here to look at. Fabrication methods, for example. How are you going to produce, in this case, I'm thinking things like machining, metalwork. There's a whole army of methods. You have injection molding, you can machine from solid, you can 3D print, you can laser sinter. There are so many techniques and methods available to you. And as a result, you have highly variable costs. Something that is 3D printed perhaps has a very low NRE, but a higher piece part, or perhaps is a lower volume. Something that's injection molded on a multi-impression bolster in hardened steel tooling will have a very high investment cost, but a very low piece part. And it's that balancing act. Where are you spending enough in terms of cost to give you, for example, the tooling or the testing or the methodology without necessarily having the worst possible impact on the price of the product? Equally, as I've mentioned before, your testing regimen or your testing process, your cost here is in your labor, your test operators, your test technicians, your jigs, your fixtures, your data analysis. And there is a trade-off required. You can test everything to the nth degree, but you will have a very expensive product. Equally, the opposite end of the equation, you do very little testing, you run a higher risk of things slipping through and having field failures. Component specificity, we've spoken about a great deal. It does increase your design effort, going through the effort now of choosing secondary or tertiary component choices for your critical parts. It does take longer in terms of being able to choose and select different components. But the price, of course, is that you would gain or lose, depending on which way you've gone, flexibility in the event of supply issues. You can very quickly swap components and swap choices if you have those components available to you, as opposed to having to go and look out on the open market and redesign. And finally, your manufacturing approach. Cost here generally is split between outsourcing to a company such as ITL or in-house. Now, if you're outsourcing realistically, your cost here is the margin for a company such as us, and on top of that, your own efforts to audit and maintain that supplier. But in-house, this can be extensive. If you don't already have your own manufacturing facility, you are looking at a significant engineering cost, a significant business cost and investment cost to give yourself that functionality. But you can make that choice, and it's up to you where you want to spend the money, because at the end of the day, a development project is always expensive. It's just choosing where and when to put that money. And at that point, I'm going to hand back to our host. Thank you very much for listening. All yours.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tom. That was a very interesting presentation that you did. Now, just a reminder to the audience, in order to ask your questions, you can send them in via the questions widget. So just type them into the box. It should be at the top left-hand corner of your screen, and then click submit. And then we will do our best to answer all the questions in the time that we have. And also, if you want to get the slides or the extra resources that Tom has provided, you can click on the green resources list at the bottom, and then you'll be able to see a list of the resources. But now let's have a look at the questions. So Tom, the first question that has come is, what are the most important factors to consider when designing and manufacturing a medical device?
I think there's an awful lot of factors that come into play, and I've spoken about a few at length in the last kind of 40, 45 minutes. I think for me, the big one that I would focus on is what I started with, which is features. Are you trying to make a Swiss Army knife, or are you trying to make something that is very stripped back and doing a single job, but doing it very, very, very well? And I think a lot of the time we as human beings have a natural desire to have as many bells and whistles as we can. Certainly with the way technology is evolving now, we have all these new abilities that we can access, all these new technologies that may look great on a marketing flyer, but are they actually adding too much to your business? So I think for me, I would say focus on your feature set. That will tell you how complicated a design it is, how complex the manufacturing is. And if at the end of the day, the product is going to be profitable. At the end of the day, a product has to make money. That's why everyone's here, not just to improve healthcare, to improve people, but the company has to be around still doing that in the next 5, 10, 20 years from now. But a good question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your answer. So the next question would be, how will I know if my product has mass market potential?
Again, a very good question. I think mass market potential comes down again to looking at what need are you solving. And you'll often find products that are perhaps very broad, perhaps trying to solve multiple problems or multiple issues. That's not necessarily always the ideal way to go. I think the way that you'll know that your product has mass market appeal is it fixing a problem? Is it making a treatment more effective? Is it making a treatment more accessible? Is it something that is being taken up by the clinicians in a positive way? And I think the clinicians are often not given enough regard in the development process. There's a lot of clinicians that have years and decades of experience in their field, and I think often disruptive technologies can effectively look to replace the clinician, replace the consultant, replace the expert. And I think you get a little bit more pushback that effectively, the robots are doing us out of a job effectively. So I think it's also treading that fine line where you're aiding the clinician and you're improving the clinician's ability without necessarily trying to put him in the dole queue or her in the dole queue. And finding that balancing act, that'll tell you if you've got mass market potential. You're going to be taken up by the users, taken up by the patients, and deliver an effective treatment.
Okay, thank you very much for that answer. So moving over to the next question, which is, how can I ensure a smooth transition from design and development to manufacture?
My number one tip, I think, for that would be engage with a manufacturing partner as soon as you possibly can. I gave a talk at an exhibition not too long ago up in Birmingham that was on actually that subject. And I think very often people are reticent to engage with a manufacturing partner until they're effectively ready to push the button. What can often happen at that stage is, certainly if it's a company that perhaps doesn't have as much experience with device manufacture, there are points that they could have had some easy wins on that perhaps have been missed. And I think engaging with a manufacturing partner really, really, really early and asking for their honest input from day one. We want to lay it out like this. What do you think? We want to be able to test this. What do you think? And you'll find that a good manufacturing team, certainly a good production engineering team, will be able to add a lot to your engineering team as they're developing the product. And the quicker they're involved and the quicker you're able to narrow down your partner, the quicker they can be involved in that design handover. And you have plenty of time to do things like validation runs. If you want to do IQ, OQ, PQ, if you want to do any sort of design verification, you've got the time to get that process underway. So I would say engage early and be honest with your manufacturer.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that answer. Just a reminder to the audience, if you have any questions that you would like to ask Tom, you can pop them in via the questions widget at the top left-hand corner of your screen. Then just write them, click submit, and then we will answer them. Okay, moving on. So Tom, the next question would be, how should we decide whether to manufacture in-house or whether we should outsource?
Good question. I think I'm going to be biased, obviously, with ITL being an outsourced manufacturing partner. I think there is a point for every company where they have to decide where do they want to be. I think there is a natural urge to try and be the jack of all trades, to use the popular expression, which does or doesn't tend to be the right method. It doesn't tend to always be the obvious route forward. I think one of the big decisions to make is, where is your company strong? Is your company strong on coming up with the next best idea, looking after the customer, that market engagement, going out and dealing with clinicians? Do you want to have engineering effort and production effort and the overhead and the space and the cost of setting that up? And certainly internal cost of manufacturing is something that's often, I think, missed. Certainly cost of staffing. There's very often where we're asked to compare to an internal development cost, and it's done purely on a parts cost or materials cost. And people forget that people cost money. You're paying salary to your staff, you're keeping the lights on, you're keeping the place warm. These all add costs. So I think the initial decision to make is, where are you strong? If your strengths lie in the front end and dealing with the customers and the clinicians, focus on that. If you have a very engineering heavy team and you've got lots of in-house experience around production, then you may decide that's the option for you and you're going to go straight from day one with the heavy investment and your own production facilities. Or you may decide to toe a middle ground. There are companies that we've worked with before where perhaps they've made the first low volume in-house to give them that security, to let them understand their true cost of goods, and then they've outsourced because the volumes are getting larger and more complex and beyond their comfort zone. Or equally, we've had companies where they've outsourced at the start whilst they've upskilled their team, and then they've taken it back in-house. And a good manufacturing partner who, again, you're being open and honest with, you can have that conversation and say, look, our plan in 5 years' time is we're going to effectively in-source this again. This is a temporary deviation. We're just working with you in the short term. Or it may be a case of, look, we've built the first 1,000 in-house and we just don't have the capacity to keep up. We need to outsource and work with you. So I think my advice there would be look at where you're strongest, look at where your focus is, and then build your outsourcing model to whatever level you need it around where your strengths lie. And don't try and do everything yourself.
Okay, thank you for that answer, Tom. So moving over to the next question. It is, we want our device to get to the market on time and within budget. Can you give an insight on the best way to make this possible?
I think on time and on budget are probably two of the most popular used expressions, I think, in any development program, no matter where you are. I think the main focus with on time and on budget is spending that time up front in identifying what it is you're developing and then sticking to it, unless you have a really good reason to change. And this is something actually that we've done a lot of recently at ITL. We've been investing actually in training up all our team onto Prince 2. And there's some great methodology within that and other project management approaches where you're looking at avoiding what I call specification creep or spec creep. And it can often happen, I think, when companies ask opinions from across their business. We've had projects in the past where, and I say this terribly about sales and marketing people being a sales and marketing person, where sales and marketing have a wish list. That wish list gets assimilated into the design process verbatim, and it means that by the time the product comes to market, it's a bigger, bulkier, more expensive, over time and over budget beast than perhaps the market-driven, as opposed to the sales-driven methodology, which was saying, this is the product we're launching, we're going to stick to this. So I think having that definition up front of what it is you want to develop and not allowing that specification to move, or if it does need to move, doing that in the most controlled way possible. Change is inevitable. There is always change on a project, but it's how you manage that change and taking the time to document it, identify it, risk assess it, and choose, are we going to make this change or not? Are we going to do a small change? Are we going to do a big change? Are we going to do nothing at all? Managing change is the best way to maintain a tight specification and therefore an on-target delivery in terms of time, budget, and indeed every stakeholder in the business is happy.
Brilliant. That's a great answer, Tom. And it looks like this was our final question. So
perfect time.
Right now on the screen, you are seeing Tom's email. So if you have any further questions, you can drop him an email there and he will do his best to give you an answer. So that just leaves me to thank Tom for what was a great presentation and to ITL for sponsoring this session. To all the attendees, you will receive an email shortly telling you how you can access the on-demand version of this webinar. So you can access this through our website, which is pmi-life.com. We look forward to sharing further webinars with you, so please do keep an eye out on the website I just mentioned, and follow us on Twitter at BRWebinars, and join our LinkedIn group called Business Review Webinars. Thank you once again, and I hope you have a great day.